Hi, I'm Jan Risher. I'm the Louisiana Culture Editor for the Georgia's Media Group here in Louisiana, and we are so glad that you're joining us for the discussion of From Here to the Great Unknown by Lisa Marie Presley and her daughter Riley Keogh. Before we get started, I just want to give a big thank you to John Balance. He's the behind-the-scenes guy who makes our book clubs work, and we're grateful for all of his help and expertise. Next, I'd like to introduce the panel who we have today joining the discussion. First, we are honored to have Roy Turner. Roy is a Tupelo, Mississippi native, and if you are familiar at all with Elvis, you understand the significance of Tupelo. It's his birthplace, and Roy is actually the executive director of the Elvis Presley birthplace in Tupelo. Thank you for joining us, Roy.
Thank you for asking me.
All right. And next, we have Annie Vaden. And Annie is a social worker at Manning Family Children's Hospital, formerly Children's Hospital of New Orleans. She specializes in trauma and grief. And Annie, we're really grateful that you're able to join us today as well.
Happy to be here.
And third, we have Lauren Sheremy. And Lauren is the features coordinator here at the Advocate in Baton Rouge. And she works really hard on Louisiana Inspired. She worked with Louisiana Inspired to help start it for about 2 years. And she does all sorts of other things in the features department. And she finished the book this morning.
Yes, I finished listening to it.
So we're really glad that you are joining us as well, Lauren, and appreciate all your help. And actually, I'm going to start with you because I think your answer and my answer and probably Roy's and Annie's is a little bit different. How familiar were you with Lisa Marie's story before you read the book?
I was not really at all. I was familiar with the fact that she was a figure like in pop culture and society, and obviously that she was Elvis's daughter, but in terms of the details of her life and all that she had went through, not familiar at all. So it was very interesting to listen to her.
Well, what about you, Annie?
Yeah, I think kind of similar to Lauren, I was familiar with Lisa Marie from the headlines. I think in particular from my childhood, I remember that awkward kiss with Michael Jackson at the MTV Movie Awards, and familiar with her daughter, Riley, just from seeing her in some of her films and seeing her as a talented actor. But I learned a lot from this book. I found it fascinating.
All right. Now let's go to Roy, who I think will be a very sharp contrast because, like Roy, I too grew up in Mississippi, and I mean, I felt like these people were my people, but in fact, they really are your people. I mean, you have struck up kin with the Presleys. So, Roy, I mean, how familiar were you with this story?
Well, I grew up in the shadow of Elvis, and he's always been part of our story, as has Lisa Marie. So I probably knew more about her than you guys, but I didn't know about a lot of the sorrow in her life.
Yeah, I think that when you and I were talking earlier, Roy, just about her relationship with her mother, that was a shock to me. And you made a really interesting observation about photographs of Lisa and Priscilla. Do you remember what you told me?
Yes, I had not really noticed it before until listening to the book. She's very sad in every photograph with her mother, which is odd. And it's also very telling. And I'm surprised I'd never really picked up on it before. But it does seem that, ironically, like her father, whose life took a drastic turn when he was 22 and lost his mother, I think life did the same thing at the early age of 9 when she lost her father.
Yeah, and it was sad from there. I mean, there was a definite shadow of sadness over the rest of her life. And because a lot of people probably aren't as familiar with Elvis's birthplace, Roy, could you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Of course, he was born in Tupelo. He lived here for almost 14 years. So all of his adolescent years were spent here, his formative years, where he learned his morals and mores, where he got his faith. We have a 15-acre park, which was actually a gift from Elvis when he was 21 years old for the children of this community. This was the poorer side of town, quote, wrong side of the tracks. And he knew that. And when he came back in 56 to do his homecoming concert, when it was over, he gave the funds back to our mayor and said, I noticed the house I was born in 15 acres for sale. I want you to take this money, purchase it, and build a park for those kids in East Tupelo. He came back the following year and did another concert and donated that money to build a youth center. I was one of the kids that benefited from that. In fact, I had my first dance in 9th grade in that youth center, which is now our museum. But evidently, Tupelo was a warm fuzzy in his heart because he always had it in his sight. I've heard stories where even in the 60s, when he was out in Hollywood making those movies he actually didn't enjoy making, he still had his eye back home, sending money back to various charities. And we never knew that at the time.
And apparently that sentiment has lingered because what did Riley name her child?
Named her Tupelo. And I was very amazed. Last year she gave the interview for Vogue, and the interviewer asked something along the lines of, it must be very surreal going back to your grandfather's home, which you were never there when he was there, and yada, yada. And her response was, no, that's our home. We would spend our holidays there. And after closing hours, we would bring his cooks in when they were still alive to cook the meals that he enjoyed, turnip greens, cornbread. And I thought, my God, this girl eats Southern.
So I think that Riley, and if you have, if you've read the book, you understand that it is an unusual format. It is in two voices. They've got all these tapes from Lisa Marie, which I always called her Lisa Marie. In the book, they call her Lisa. And then Riley was able to fill in the gaps. So I thought that was just a marvelous structure for the book. And one thing that I learned recently is, and I have the book here, the little dots, they look like dots there that are between the voices. I didn't realize this, but those are actually the matching tattoos that Lisa Marie and her son Ben got. And Riley decided to use those to denote the change in voice. So I thought that was a fascinating thing.
I didn't know that.
Annie, I just wanted to, Riley seems remarkably well adjusted to have grown up in the chaos that she grew up in that's documented in the book. What is your take on that, and just the way that grief passed from generation to generation?
So I think that what Lisa Marie did an amazing job of was to create this connection with Elvis, even though he had passed away long before Riley was born and, pretty early into Lisa's childhood. So Roy talking about how Riley commented on that was their family home, that they would have all the food that Elvis had cooked when he was alive. That's a beautiful way to create legacy for him in a way that the world did not, he has his legacy with the world, but this was special to their family. And I think what Lisa learned to do somehow on her own through her own strength, because it does not seem like her mother, Priscilla, was, very attentive to Lisa's grief and losing her father. She really allowed that space for her family to be able to grieve in a healthy way. And I think, that even when she lost her son, Ben, Riley's brother, that she kind of gave them the space as a whole family to take the time to really lean into their bereavement and really grieve Ben. And so I think that has helped Riley to be able to feel open to talk about her grief and talk about her loved ones who she lost. And I think so often in American culture, we want to like shove the grief away, and we think we can't talk about it, or we can't talk about the person who has died because it's going to upset people, when really, as you can see from Riley talking about it, they, in that time period, their grieving period after they lost him, they just spent so much time talking about him and all the wonderful memories of him. And even this book, you know, was almost a practice for Lisa Marie in talking about Elvis and being able to have her grief process just in simply talking about him. So I think that Lisa learning from her mother's mistakes, that helped Riley to kind of be a more well-adjusted person.
Yeah. One thing, and I'll go ahead and mention this, even though it's kind of jumping ahead in the book. One thing that really surprised me was their response to Ben's death and the unusual thing that they did with his body. Annie, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think probably everybody remembers from reading the book because it was pretty memorable, but they actually kept his body in like a casita on the property with dry ice. And I think Lisa said in her part, keeping the temperature in the casita very low to preserve his body, which is highly unusual. We are used to the body goes to the morgue, and then the body goes to the funeral home, and then they are buried or cremated shortly after that. So that definitely raised my eyebrows. And but I think it's also just a reminder that everybody grieves in a different way. And it seemed to be very memorable for those, you know, the small group of family members who knew about it. I think Riley was able to name, when they were talking about the tattoos, that she knew that this was very unusual and was a little nervous about letting people outside of the family know about that. But it seemed to be very impactful for them and seemed to help them in their grief. So, you know, there's no rule book for grief.
There is definitely not a rule book for grief. But you mentioned, you know, just the fact that they shared that, Riley chose to share those details. There were so many details in the book that that surprised me. I mean, the details about Lisa Marie's relationship with Michael Jackson, I remember that well. I was working at USA Today at the time, and I remember being in a news meeting that afternoon and talking about the front page for the next day. And then there was a press conference later that they had gotten married. It was one of the strangest news stories, and it remains strange, but it sounds like they actually had a relationship. Lauren, I know that some of this was new to you. What do you think about that?
Well, I remember her saying that Michael Jackson is the one who taught her how to shut people out, and like she later discovered that. I think just growing up as someone who like appreciates and witnesses pop culture, that I heard about that, but I didn't know the details. But it sounded like each relationship she had was meaningful. Like Lisa Marie just sounded like she wasn't, you know, we'll never know, but it sounded like she never really did anything for the press. She said she hated the press, and she, you know, didn't like attention on herself. So it just kind of felt like each relationship that she had, she was all in, and I think she so desperately wanted something to work. And she also just seemed very intuitive with herself and other people's feelings, and just appreciative of people who were honest with her.
And if you're watching and you have questions, feel free to put the questions in the chat, and we'll get those. But Roy, regarding the Michael Jackson relationship, and just I was also amazed by the role the Church of Scientology played. I mean, they played such a huge part in Lisa Marie's growing up. Were you as aware of that, or did that come as a surprise to you as well?
Well, I was aware of that relationship with the church because it was always in the news.
Right.
Touching on what Lauren said, her sensitivity to others and picking up on their pain and etc. That's very much like her father. He had that same almost sixth sense, and he would act on it. That's one reason he gave so freely to people less fortunate. So I think that's a trait that she came by honest.
Roy, in terms when she was talking about what it was like growing up at Graceland when she was before her dad died, with the wrecking of the golf carts and all of that, I was like, as a mom, I was like, somebody do something, get some discipline here. What were your thoughts?
She was obviously a very spoiled brat.
Ooh, yes.
And I will say it probably put Priscilla in a very delicate, precarious position in that somebody's got to be the authoritarian and someone else is just all play, suffer no consequences. That had to put a strain on Priscilla and Elvis's relationship and how their daughter was being raised. But evidently, it just worked great for Lisa Marie. I mean, she absolutely did rule the roost. And the few people I've had an opportunity to talk to who were there, some of whom were her age, they'll tell you just how ruthless she was. You know, she cracked the whip for an 8-9-year-old.
Like what?
Well, you know, she would tell some of the people if they got on to her, "You're fired." And of course, Elvis would hire him back. But, you know, that had to be intimidating for the workers for this child to just rule you around. And they all evidently took it with a very good upper stiff lip. Of course, they all needed their jobs, I'm sure.
Well, the cast of characters who were there, that was an interesting thing as well, with all the cousins and then the stepbrothers and all of that.
And there were others living on the grounds. You know, one of his nurses, Tish Henley, she had her family up in a trailer in the back of Graceland, and her children grew up with Lisa Marie playing, as did some of the other workers, which gave her as normal. I would say her time in Memphis was as much akin to a normal childhood as she probably got anywhere else. I doubt in California, and I wasn't there, so I don't know, but my doubts are that it was quite as normal on the West Coast as it was in Memphis.
Other than the part where she could fire adults.
Yes, right.
In terms of Elvis's birthplace, I know that the book isn't really about that specifically, but could you tell us, just give people a sense of, like, I know people come from all over the world. Describe the house to the people who haven't seen it.
Okay. Well, it's 2 rooms, 450 square feet, built by Elvis's father, grandfather, and uncle, probably from a kit that was purchased at the local lumber company. Very utilitarian, very plain. The front room was a bedroom. The back room was a kitchen. They had running water. I'm sorry, they didn't have running water. They may have had electricity. It was available, but I don't know if they could afford it. They burned coal to keep warm in the winter, cooked on a wood stove. They were there for 3 years. But evidently some of his fondest memories were there. And I do know as in early ages of 2 and 3 years old, you do have childhood memories that stick. I have a very vivid one when I was either 1 or 2 of our house burning. And we went next door to my grandparents. And all my life, I've had this vision of my grandmother holding me in her arms at the window, watching our house burn and me laughing at the flames. That has always just been embedded in my psyche. So I know I didn't dream it. Elvis would come back frequently. In fact, Priscilla toured the birthplace about 10 years ago. And she said during their marriage, they came roughly 5 times. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Elvis would wake up, come downstairs and say, "Hey, let's go to Tupelo." And they would just ride around looking at all the sights from his childhood, where he was born, where he went to school, where he got his first guitar, where he used to swim, just reliving his childhood. And for him to do that, it must have been special memories. But there again, like I said earlier, his childhood memories were Tupelo. He's 2 months shy of his 14th birthday when he moves to Memphis. So those are his teenage years. And I'm sure his life changed for the better and for the worse when you're changing your surroundings so drastically.
And I know that you have, you genuinely do have common relatives with Elvis. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, but they're way up the line. My closest would be my youngest daughter is married to a fourth cousin of his.
Okay, there you go.
But up the line, we share, I think it's maybe his third great grandfather and my fourth great grandfather are the same man.
Oh.
But I never knew of any connection growing up. I just knew about this guy from Tupelo who gave all of us children in Tupelo, or at least some of us, I think especially on the east side of town, this sense that, Elvis came from basically nothing and did some great things. So that possibility is there for all of us. I think we got that from him, whether it was conscious or subconscious.
Wow. And I think that, if you contrast the way that he grew up to the way, for example, that Riley grew up, I mean, there's just so few commonalities in the structure of their lives. But Annie, I wondered about your thoughts on the role that Riley's father played in really creating a safety net. To me, it seemed from reading the book, creating a safety net and some appreciated structure. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that both from Lisa's perspective and Riley's perspective, he was a constant in their lives and was that safety net for them and never abandoned Lisa Marie when he, probably could have many times. And I think that was probably really important for Lisa Marie to have in addition to Riley. Of course, any child would always benefit from having both parents be very involved in their lives. But I think, for him to continue to be a good friend and a good support to Lisa Marie when that was something that she seemed to really be lacking, as much as I'm sure Priscilla tried her best with what she had to be a parent to Lisa, just the losing her father at age 9, who she adored and looked up to so much. And from her perspective now, even when he was throwing his tantrums, it was just something to laugh about and get over. And he was, such a perfect presence in her life from her perspective. And then I think she was kind of searching for that connection that she had with her father, with Elvis, for the rest of her life. And, whether that was from her boyfriends that she had when she was too young, which even turned out to be Riley's father, Danny, continued to show up from them. And then this connection with Michael Jackson, and just her different marriages and relationships, always seeking for that. And, really at the end of the day, it was Danny that continued to be that connection for them, and modeled. I think that again contributed to Riley being a pretty well-rounded person, even having experienced multiple traumas in her life, is that she did have this constant support from her father. And that, it seems that Danny and Lisa really co-parented both of their children really well together, even though they weren't in a romantic relationship for most of their children's lives.
It was really interesting how, they would just do things like, let's go to Hawaii, and that wild story about Danny in Hawaii and how they were just all together. And it was the candor of the book and the insight it gave to that lifestyle, that extreme wealth beyond comprehension lifestyle, to me was fascinating.
Yeah, I think for sure for Riley, again, I mean, you have Riley, who does seem to be pretty well-rounded and has been able to have a successful career and avoid any, some of these substance abuse that her family members have experienced, and for Ben to unfortunately have gone a different direction. That's kind of, they did live that kind of fast and loose lifestyle, as much as there was love there with the whole family unit. So it is remarkable that she is as well-rounded as she is.
You mentioned addiction. When you think about the pattern of addiction, and it's hard to say, the intertwining of addiction and grief in their generational stories, what the role there is of grief versus, which one was first, the apple or the cart, or however you say that.
Yeah, and is it kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy too, for
Right.
Lisa to say, well, my grandmother and my father had this special connection, and my grandmother drank herself to death. And then, obviously Elvis having his addiction issues, and her feeling like that was an inevitability for her, that she would be facing these addiction issues, and finding meaning from Ben and his addiction issues and his death, because, that to them it was almost written in the stars.
Right. Roy, in terms of Elvis's mom, Gladys, do you think, and just as you were saying that, Annie, it made me think, like, I wonder if that's really where this story of grief started.
Well, I think it, excuse me, I think it even starts a bit earlier with Elvis's twin being stillborn.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
Because Gladys and Vernon both took that very hard. And on Elvis's behalf, I started researching Elvis in the early 80s when Gladys's contemporaries were still alive, and we could interview them as well as people who grew up with Elvis. Vernon and Gladys always spoke of Jesse in the present tense, never in the past tense. Now, that had to be a bit confusing for a child. And Gladys would make remarks, and possibly Vernon too, but I particularly remember them attributing this to Gladys. You've got to live twice as hard. You've got to do twice as good, because you're living for two. You're living for yourself and your brother. When I was helping Elaine Dundee do Elvis and Gladys, she read extensively on twinships and all the good, bad, and the different things about twin relationships. Of course, we don't know if they were identical or not. There was no way in rural Mississippi to know at that time. But his childhood friend, James Osborne, said when they would cut through the woods to go to Tulip Creek to swim, one of the shortcuts took them through Priceville Cemetery, where Jesse is buried. And Elvis would always say, I got to go by and see Jesse. And they would stop at the grave. James said, for a kid, it seemed like forever. It was probably 5 seconds. And he would just stand there quietly for however long and say, okay, I'm ready. Well, that's kind of unusual behavior for a child, for a boy that age. So that grief was always present. Then you have the separation with the father going away to the penitentiary when he is 3, and he and his mother bond into such a tight bond that I don't know if Vernon could have gotten in there had he tried. And I don't mean that mean. I don't think they were trying to exclude him. It's just that they were all they had for a 9-month period. And they were literally hanging on by a string during that 9 months. And it just put them in such a tight. I used to say they were one soul in 2 bodies. That's the best way I could describe them. They thought so much alike. They reacted to things so much alike. And then in the South, growing up, I'm 72, I think. Grief was such a big show in my childhood. We would have the body laid out. First, my grandmother, when I was real young, was laid out in the home. I remember that. And I was maybe 5 years old, and she died 6 at the most. I'm not sure. Made a very indelible mark. But then later we got uptown and started leaving the body at the funeral home. Yet one or more family members would sit up all night at the funeral home and not leave that body alone. And grief in my family in particular, and it was that way in the Presleys, was a very demonstrative thing, throwing yourself on a casket and mourning loudly, a lot of the aunts and what have you. Vernon mourned that way when Gladys died, and Elvis did too. That's the way they had been taught to mourn. They had seen it, in the family. I think all of that came into play in bringing the sadness on. Gladys was an alcoholic, died, according to her sister Lillian, of cirrhosis of the liver, which is another story. But I once said, because I come from a highly addictive family, I joke, all my cousins, which I'm one of 42 grandkids, believe it or not. There's only about 11 of us left now, but I jokingly say all my first cousins either became alcoholics or Church of Christ preachers, and I became neither, so I really don't know what that makes me. But I saw so many of my cousins become alcoholics like their fathers. I chose not to become one like my father because of my father. But still, it had a very strong impact on who I was and how I reacted to things. Anyway, the point I made at one point was alcohol was the elixir of the South for so many years. You take a poor group of people. At that time, there's really no psychiatry. If so, it's not affordable. Nobody ever heard of counseling. My father's alcoholism began when my oldest sister died at 8 months, and he went from a social drinker to an alcoholic. That was self-medication. I think Gladys may have done a lot of self-medication, and I've talked too much, but I hope I give you the gist of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You didn't talk too much. Annie, do you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, I think, all of the addiction cases that we saw in this book, I agree with you. That was self-medication, even as much warning as, Lisa Marie had, at least, in being aware of the addiction issues, just still kind of ending up down that path. And I think, I didn't know about that he had a twin who was stillborn. So I loved learning that. And I actually think that that's great that he would go visit his twin's grave kind of every time they passed by and had that connection. And I can't imagine what it would be like to have a twin who, you would have that connection with, but you never really got to have that connection with outside of the womb. And then to have the pressure of your family telling you, them kind of coping with their grief by saying, well, this child has to live for 2 children. And who knows what would have happened if Jesse had survived, and would Elvis's life had looked completely different because he didn't have his parents pushing him to live for 2 children. So I think there can be an extreme to legacy building where it can negatively affect the child and make them feel like they're not good enough in comparison with the idea of this child who was never able to live. But then also being able to feel that connection even when they're not with you by doing things like saying, I'm going to visit Jesse, and visiting his graveside, and making sure to always recognize that you do have a brother, even if they're not right there with you.
Roy, what kind of work did Gladys and Vernon do?
Vernon did carpentry. He also drove delivery trucks. Gladys worked in the garment plant prior to Elvis's birth. She did not work, to my knowledge, while he was growing up here in Tupelo. But then after they moved to Memphis, she becomes employed as a nurse's aide in the hospital. But Vernon basically would drive delivery trucks, or he did carpentry work.
And in terms of, I've read this before, but I'd love to hear it from you. Tell us about Elvis buying his first guitar in Tupelo.
Oh, yeah. It was his 11th birthday. And he goes into Tupelo Hardware with his mother with the intention of buying a rifle, which she was very much against. And with the help of Mr. Bobo, the clerk in there, who also was a neighbor of theirs out in the East Tupelo community, convinced him to pick up the guitar, look at it, strum it, which he didn't know how to play at that time. Convinced him to go with the guitar instead. And, we like to say he went into Tupelo Hardware to buy a rifle and walked out with the guitar that changed the face of not only American music, but world music. He goes directly to his pastor, Brother Frank Smith, who teaches him 3 chords, and I never can remember what they are. They're like A, G, and maybe C. And Brother Frank says, if you learn these 3 chords, you can play anything. Well, then he goes to Mississippi Slim, who is a local radio personality, kind of a poor man's Hank Williams, who is also the older brother of his childhood friend James Osborne, who he's stopping at Jesse's grave with. And Slim teaches us some more chords. And he takes it and runs with it from there. He's playing, his repertoire in Tupelo consists of 3 songs. Oh Ship, which is very maudlin. A little ditty that went something like, there's a leaf on the limb, and there's a leaf on the limb, and the limb on the trunk, and the trunk in the hole, and the hole in the ground, the green grass grew all around, a little ditty. And the other one was God Bless My Daddy, which was this boy praying to God to keep his father safe during World War II. So it and Old Shep, which is about a boy that has to kill his dog, are very maudlin. But he literally wore those songs out in Tupelo to the point the kids were saying, oh, God, here he comes. Let's go the other direction. But, he was very determined at an early age. And he says this, when he's elected one of the outstanding young men by the JCs in Memphis, he knew at a very early age that it would be a song that would get him through. And I think he did.
So I didn't know he was elected one of the outstanding young men by the JCs. How old was he when that happened?
Well, say that's early 70s, maybe 72 off the top of my head.
Already super successful.
Yes.
Okay. I thought it may have been, in high school. So. Roy, as Alana Nash, who is a biographer, she was going to be with us today. She couldn't be with us, so we miss you, Alana. But whenever I told her that you were going to be a part of the panel, she said, well, that's like having 2 or 3 people. And I understand what she meant. But do you have a favorite Elvis story?
Oh, gee. Well, I do. Because when he's 5 years old, he enters the talent show at the local fair. And by the way, he comes in 5th place, only to come back 11 years later, 21 years old, the hottest thing in America. Does 2 shows to over 10,000 people on that same stage. He came in 5th place a mere 11 years earlier, because that tells you how much your life can change in such a short span. If you're focused, if you're determined, if you've got a mission and nothing's going to deter you. Because he was told at the Grand Ole Opry, you can't sing, go back to driving a truck. But he's hanging outside WELO. This kind of shows you the kind of guy Elvis was. This little 10-year-old boy hanging outside WELO, and Charlie Boren, the station manager, comes out and he says, Charlie, can I be in the talent show? And Charlie says, yes, Elvis, if you won't sing Old Ship. Well, the day of the talent show, I have a sound bite where he says, when I was 10 years old, my parents put me in a talent show. I sang a cappella. I wore glasses. Oh, yeah. And I got a whooping, not a whipping. I got a whooping when I got home for riding one of the rides I wasn't supposed to ride. And he just does this belly laugh. This was just a year or 2 before he died. And I thought that story's important to him. He's still telling it all these years later. So about 1962, I was interviewing Charlie Boren's widow back in the 2005 for a documentary I was working on. She said about 1962, the phone rang and Charlie answers. Says, Charlie, this is Elvis. Just wanted you to know, cut a record of Old Ship, sold 1 million copies, and just laughed and laughed. I found several instances where he would gig somebody back home in a very jovial way, lighthearted. I knew what I was doing. That's one of my favorite stories.
Wow. So sweet. I mean, it's like, there's just such tenderness with so much of those moments of him. And then when you look at those early pictures of him, I actually was in Graceland last year. My mom lives in Olive Branch. Annie, Lauren, and the rest of y'all excuse us for a moment while we play what we call the Mississippi game. And by the way, my aunt's sister was a tour guide at the birthplace for years and years. So she's from Ecru. You know where Ecru is.
I know Ecru.
But when we were at Graceland last summer, there's so many pictures of him just young and just so healthy. And then in sharp contrast to what happened. It really is sad.
My favorite Elvis era is the 50s, or prior to going into the Army. He's young. He's got this raw talent, totally untrained. It's just going with the flow, what he feels. He has nothing but promise and hope ahead. He has no idea of the sorrows that lie ahead. It's my favorite Elvis time.
Mm-hmm.
It was because it's hope.
Right. And he still represents hope.
Oh, yes.
So, question for this book, on a scale of 1 to 10, Annie, what would you give this book and why?
I would say it was a solid 8. I think I really liked the style of having kind of the raw footage, not footage, but the words straight out of Lisa Marie's mouth, and then kind of have Riley come in to do further explanation or give her perspective when needed. It made me laugh when they were talking about how she had met Riley's father, and then Riley would chime in and kind of saying, well, this is my dad's perspective, and it was different from Lisa's. And just, I think, like you touched on, just the candidness of how both of them shared so much. I think the only reason I would have given it an 8 instead of a 9 or a 10 is just, that Lisa unfortunately passed away before they could really finish it together. And so I think there's some things that are left unanswered, but I think it was a really insightful and fascinating read for me.
Yeah. Lauren, what about you?
I agree. I don't really know what I would change about it. I enjoyed it a lot. I thought there was a lot of chasing in this book, in terms of, I felt like, especially Lisa Marie, always chasing, like, whether it be her love from her father or answers about her father, and then that kind of got passed down. And I thought it was interesting. You think people with fame and money and endless resources, that they're satisfied. But it was the complete opposite. I felt like Lisa Marie was constantly chasing happiness, or just to be okay.
And so what would you give it on a scale of 1 to 10?
I think I also 8.59.
8.59. All right.
I enjoyed it a lot, especially listening to it. Highly recommend.
Yeah. And Roy, what about you? You've probably read so many books about Elvis.
Before anybody had answered, as soon as you asked that question, I came up with an 8. So we must all be on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
I've read a lot of biographies and autobiographies, and I don't know of an autobiography that's ever, a person has ever bared themselves so naked as Lisa Marie does in this book. That took a lot of guts. I also think it was probably extremely cathartic for her, and that was probably the impetus behind the whole thing. But that, as much as it probably helped address her pain, it was probably very painful. And I admire her for doing that, because especially when she talks about the abuse. I forget, was it sexual or physical or what? But that's hard stuff to deal with, and to deal with so publicly. And I think she did it as much to help others as herself, because after Ben died, she was having these sessions in her home, inviting others in who had lost a child under similar circumstances, trying to help them get through.
Right.
It showed a very compassionate side of her that impressed me.
And also for Riley's courage. I mean, listening to that so short after her mom had passed.
I don't know how she did it.
Yeah. I mean, I watched Riley in Daisy Jones and the Six and was impressed with her performance and her voice. But after listening and reading this book, I did both. I don't know if I said this earlier, but Julia Roberts narrates the voice. If you haven't listened to it, Julia Roberts narrates the voice of Lisa Marie. And then sometimes they have little clips of Lisa Marie's actual tapes in the audio. So it's super interesting. But I'm impressed with Riley Keough, and I just pray that she's able to stay on this path.
Amen.
You know, so
I think she's certainly the person to take the helm of the Presley legacy so
right.
far. From what she has shown so far, I think she's doing a wonderful job.
And my understanding, I'm sure, Roy, you know more details about this, but there was some legal something about Graceland, but she and her younger twin sisters now have ownership. Is that correct?
That's correct. That was a fraud, a lady who has been known for pulling off fraudulent things for years. And why in the world she thought she could pull that one off, God only knows.
Yeah.
But
well, thank you all so much. Go ahead, Roy. I'm sorry.
I just think people are people. They'll try anything.
That is true. That is true.
Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you. I could sit and chat with you. This is a book to me that is just worth talking about. And it's a book that after I finished it, I really I wanted people I loved to read it so that we could talk about it. Did you have that feeling, Annie?
Yeah, I was not expecting it, but there was a lot to unpack with the generational grief and trauma too. And so I feel like I was really just reading about human beings instead of reading about these legends and, you know, what you see in the headlines. And so I'm definitely, you know, I need to go listen to the audiobook because I read it. And clearly, you know, I need to go listen to it, and then I'm going to recommend it to everybody that I know.
It's a quick read or listen. It's only, I think, about 6 or 7 hours to listen to it, and took me about, not very long to read because you can read a lot faster than you can listen to. So at this point, I will announce our next book. We do this once a quarter, and our next book is James. It's a reimagining of the story of Huckleberry Finn, and from Jim's perspective. And it's gotten all sorts of great press. A lot of people have probably already read it, but we will be discussing this book in June, and that gives you plenty of time to read it. We hope that you'll join us. And I don't know how on God's green earth I will find a panel to be as insightful and provide the kind of food for thought that you guys have, but I really am grateful that y'all were here. And I hope that, reading in a community is good for us. There is, an epidemic of loneliness, and to find things to read and think about and talk about with other people is a healthy thing to do. So join us to read James, and I'm so grateful, Roy and Annie and Lauren, for y'all joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.